Before we begin, you'll want to check your own data to make sure that all these things are true. You just want 2 columns with all your numbers in it, independent variable on the left, dependent variable on the right, no units on any numbers. Notice I've put the variable name and the unit in parentheses at the top of each column, but none of these numbers have units. That's very, very important for making sure that the computer can understand that these are numbers. If you go in and put a unit on this, like 4.6 newtons, notice it moves it over to the left. That is the computer thinking that this is a word because it has a letter in it. You don't want that. You want all your entries to be on the right side of the column, which means that the computer understands that it's a number. Once you've done that, go ahead and, before you do anything, just give your graph a title. So for example, this could be effect of mass on friction. I can tell that because this is my IV and this is my DV. That's a good title. This will just help me find it later. And then go ahead and select all your data by clicking and dragging. And if you go up here to Insert Chart, you can create a graph from this. Notice the first graph that it shows you is not the graph that we want to make. So over here it says chart type. We want to click on that and scroll down and select scatter chart. We will always make a scatter chart, and that looks much, much more like what we want to do. Just in case you want to check that these 2 things are checked, use row 1 as headers, means it's interpreting this not as a number, but as something that's going to go into axes, labels, etc. And use column A as labels means it is actually using column A for its number values. Notice if we check this off, the graph gets all funny looking because it's trying to graph both of these numbers on the vertical axis, the y-axis. That's not what we want. We want both of these checked. And then we can go ahead and start to customize our chart. We are done on this tab. I'm going to go over here and click Customize. Now, all of these things, all of these little arrows, let me make my chart exactly how I want to make it. I can change the font to something that's interesting. Never choose Comic Sans because that's silly. Other than that, you can choose whatever font you want. You can even change the background color, etc. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to get into the stuff that's actually required for making a solid graph, which looks like this. Notice my title is a decent title, but it's not the best title I could write. I'm going to change this to the effect of mass, the independent variable, on friction, and the title of the graph changes also. Notice I can also make a subtitle. I can make this say by Mr. Kramer with Joey Ramone and Justin Timberlake were my 2 lab members, my lab group members, so I'm going to write their names in there too. You don't need to have this in there, but it's a useful way to clarify the information that's going on. 2 really, really important items that you do need to be thinking about is your horizontal axis title. Notice the horizontal axis, the x-axis, has not been named here, so I have to go and then do that myself. I know the IV has to be on that x-axis. I'm going to write mass in units of kilograms, and that appears down here. And if I change this to vertical axis, I can add my dependent variable as well with units. I can change the size of all this stuff and things if you want to. You can change the color. It's up to you. Now, this part is especially important because this is where we're going to add our trend line. Before we do that, I want to show you something that's going on down here because, as we know, we need to start our graphs at 0, 0, and notice this axis is not starting at 0. I need to change that. So before we add this trend line, I'm going to go down to horizontal axis. I'm going to click on this arrow, and I'm going to look at the minimum and maximum value. It is chosen automatically a minimum and maximum value, and I want to override that and say that my minimum value needs to be 0. In fact, I could even make the maximum value something larger so that my graph is more useful for making predictions if I want to, but I don't need to do that. The most important thing is to make sure that 0 is on both axes before we move forward. So now that that's done, I'm going to go back to series, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make this trend line. The first step is just simply check in the trend line button. But we need to do a little bit more than that to actually interpret what this trend line really means. Notice this is a nice straight trend line that's kind of sort of going through the points. The computer's doing its best job to fit that, but it has no label, and it's not telling us information about what the computer has calculated. So if we go to label and we click, we can select use equation to get the equation that the computer is actually using to make that trend line. Now, one thing that's complicated here is it's given you something that's not actually an equation. Google has made a mistake here because equations always have an equals sign in them, and this equation doesn't have an equal sign. The other problem here is it's given it in a form of like y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and x is the whatever's graphed on the x-axis, but we want to actually write this with the variable names that are on the actual axis. So rather than writing x, we want to write the variable name that's on the x-axis. Rather than writing y equals, we want to write the actual variable that's on that axis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this down exactly as it's written, 23.3 times x plus this funny number here. And I'm going to think about it because I'm going to actually go back to custom once I know what I actually want to write down, and I'll write in my own words what this equation is. So this part of the equation is called the y-intercept or the initial value. If you see something that looks like this is basically telling you that it's a very, 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 very tiny number. This is what's called scientific notation. We're not going to talk about scientific notation right now, but this is saying basically that this y-intercept is not important at all. We're just going to leave it off and ignore it. So I'm left with, oopsie, where did it go? Oh, here we go. I'm left with, a trend line where I want a custom label. It's given me what it thinks I want, but that's not actually what I want at all. Now you might think that this y equals 23.3 times x, or you can use a asterisk if you want to. You might think that that's good enough. And in math class, it might be good. But in science class, we got to think more carefully about what we're doing here. First of all, the y and the x, like we were just saying, don't have any meaning for this graph. Instead of writing y, we want to write the actual variable that we graphed on the y-axis, which in this case is friction. So I'm going to write friction equals instead of y equals. Over here, instead of writing x, I'm going to write the variable on the x-axis, which in this case is mass. Now, this is a big step forward. I'm almost done here, but the last important thing is to think about what the units of this number are. Remember, all of our slope values are always going to have units, and the way we make those units is the units of the rise over the units of run. In this case, that would mean the units of rise are newtons, and the units of run are kilograms. So this would become 23.3 newtons per kilogram times mass. This is an excellent label for my trend line, so I'm going to go with it. And I'm going to click this arrow so that that disappears. Now, the last thing I want to change here is kind of optional, but it's just to make this easier to read. And if I click on legend, I can position this in a place that makes it easier to read the whole equation exactly as it's written. So I can position it inside, I can position it on the bottom. I'm usually not going to position it on the left or right, but the top actually works as well. putting it on the top is kind of my favorite because it makes us pay attention to this trend line, makes us think about what that equation means, so that we can identify the slope, and we can interpret how it's important for this particular relationship.